for Black fathers?
Well, I think there's a bunch of different things, right? So, in 2012, we did the first research project looking at Black fathers in Toronto, and it was funded by the City of Toronto,
Hmm.
and we partnered with York University as well as OISE U of T. And one of the things a couple of things that came out from that was talking about there's this isolation that Black fathers are going through. There's some issues around custody or just in where there's this intersection of race, gender, as well as class, amongst other things, that takes place in the judicial system that that doesn't give fathers the same level of access to the children as they do for mothers, basically. So I think there's this idea of parenting that it's the mother's role, like the solely, and I think what we're seeing is more fathers are being vocal and saying no, that that's not the case, right? So I think it's about creating that change that we want to see, or that reflects the reality.
So is it about a perception that because you hear all the time about these deadbeat dads and fathers not being involved in their children's lives? Is that a perception, or you think there's a truth to that?
Well, I think there's a reality, right? That you do have Black fathers that are not present, but you have that same issue in other cultures as
Hmm.
well. And I think that's that perception of Black fathers that is the only representation that is, right. So I think for me, one of the challenges when I had my first son and I was looking for supports, there wasn't any support,
Hmm.
right. I think there was this idea that um, you know Black fathers, let me share a story essentially. So,
Hmm.
I went to a family service center in my community, and I was asking, looking for a Black father support group, and the lady at the front desk looked at me like super confused, right? And she's like, we have programs for mothers, guardians, and even grandparents,
Hmm.
right? But nothing for fathers, and not to mention Black fathers, right? So this is kind of setting that story, basically, that your role as a father is not important, right? So I think it's really around creating spaces
Hmm.
for Black fathers, whether it's going to barbershops, whether it's having barbecues, whether we go on hikes. I think it's creating spaces for Black fathers and their families to engage essentially and create
So,
community.
what kind of support, I guess, what that you were looking for at the time that you couldn't find, that you were going to that space looking for? Like,
Right.
what were the needs of? Because I think a lot of people, uh, well, a lot of women
Mm-hmm.
don't really know what the needs of a father is,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so for you recognizing that you had a need that needed to be filled and you were
Mm-hmm.
going to looking for this sort of support, what was the support that you were looking
Well,
for?
for myself, I think the basic piece came down to community, right? Because I was born in Jamaica and I came here, so there was always this constant search for a community, basically. But specifically, it was looking for a space where I could speak to other men who had experience, maybe that were older, that had other that had kids that could tell me, can answer questions around discipline, or I'm burgeoning coming into masculinity. Now you throw on top of that fatherhood, that's like a whole, and I'm 21, you know what I'm saying, at the
Hmm.
time. So it's like it's all these different pieces where, and I didn't grow up with my dad, right? So it's not like, say, I could reach back into that well of experience and draw from in terms of what my dad did. I was like going off stuff I saw on TV, like Bill Cosby and the Huxtables, and that wasn't my reality, right? So I think there was this piece of talking to um, other Black men. So like I have this uncle in Brampton, and he's a dad who not just was at home, but he was like coaching his all of his sons soccer team, and and all of his sons went to post secondary, like got scholarships in the States. And I felt like there were dads, like, so I had other dads, whether it's uncles or men in the community, that was actually fathering me. But I wanted to do it a bit intentionally in my community in Scarborough, and not necessarily have to pick up the phone, you know?
Hmm. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you face. Now, your organization is called the Black Daddies Club.
Mm-hmm.
Why not just the Daddies Club?
Correct. Yeah.
What are some of the things that are unique to the Black experience
Right.
that other cultures may not necessarily come across. And you know, how to use your organization and you as a leader, how do you kind of touch on those things? So we're going to take a quick break,
Okay.
and when we come back, we want to hear a little bit more about that with Brendan.
The internet's number one on the World Wide Web. iLive Radio. You're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio. iLive Radio.
Welcome back to Mars Venus, and with my guest Brendan Hay from the Black Daddies Club, and so we want to talk a little bit about what the, you know, what are those needs specific to the Black experience. When you talk about Black fathers,
Right.
you know, it's all over the media. All you hear is all this negativity, and so the perception might be that, you know, that all the Black fathers are absent and all the Black fathers are non-existent, and here you are at 21. Recognizing that you had a need and you needed some support. But what are some of those things that are unique to the Black experience? Because I don't know if other nationalities are able to join your organization or what the target of it is really.
Well, yeah, the target is Black fathers, right? And there are specific needs that Black fathers face that other communities don't, you know? So one of those things is, you know, is racism. And we don't have to look further than in our city, Toronto, and seeing, you know, some of the, you know, new policy around carding that was okayed by the new police chief and as well as a new mayor, basically saying that it's okay to essentially target certain individuals that you think that you think raise a concern, and we see there's a vast disproportionate numbers in terms of who those that deemed dangerous, and those are Black men, right? If you look at the prison system in Canada, we're seeing that Black men are going to jails at faster rates than if a white man got charged with the same felony, but it's more harsher time. So we're seeing there's this increase of Black men and First Nation men filling up our prisons, basically, and there is this problem of these a lot of these men are also fathers, basically. So when they come out and they're trying to find employment, that's the difficulty in terms of with their criminal record. It's challenging, basically. So there's a cycle of, well, if I can't find a job legally, there's a certain level of desperation that happens now that I'm a father versus being just a man without any responsibilities, right? So if I'm a father now and I know my kid needs, you know, diapers, or, you know, my family needs to you know, I need to do my part as a co-parent, then I may go back and do the pieces or those activities that made me money in the past, because I can't get a job legally, right? So I think there's that piece, and then there's all these issues around education. So we're seeing like Black boys, you know, getting pushed out of schools at higher rates, right? And then we're seeing that again, there's this prison pipeline that's happening, right? So I think there's this piece that we have to acknowledge, right? And we toot the horn of multiculturalism in Toronto, but I think that also gives the opportunity to hide racism, right? And not bring forth what's happening in our own backyard. So it's cool to march for what's happening in Baltimore, but I think it's also important for us to march in terms of the injustice that's happening here in the 416, right?
So what are some of the things that the tools? What are some of the tools that you provide to meet the needs of some of these men?
I think that that question in terms of tools, I think how I approach or how the spaces are is not necessarily like a teacher student kind of vibe, right? I think as fathers, I think we can recognize that no one is an expert. It's always changing, right? But I think it's more creating a space for us to share stories, right? And I think that's the important piece, and that goes back to that storytelling piece, right? Like it's much like what we're doing right now, basically, right? I think what's happening or what's happening in the past or what has happened in the past is that other folks have been telling the stories of black fathers, and that's why we're getting this imagery that black fathers non-existent. But then when we start to share these voices and these stories, basically we see that that's not necessarily the case, right? And I think a lot of that creating tool comes from within those spaces as well, right? So it's not necessarily me, Brandon Hayes, saying, yeah, this is what those tools should be. I think it's for the space for that to generate, because my reality as a black father is different than another person who may be, gay, trans, or with a criminal record, or has a disability. So I think it's important that we share those spaces, and for us to again go back to storytelling, and create some of those potential solutions, basically, right, in house, in community.
You had also mentioned that a little bit earlier. You'd mentioned about the court systems, and that there is a disparity between, I guess, black men and women, black men being able to have access to their children. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit from what your experience has seen.
Well, it's not just black men, right? So there's this really cool organization in Toronto called Fathers Resources, and it was founded by a gentleman named Danny Gusby, who passed away this year, but is still ran by his wife Heidi. And essentially, this particular program is essentially for dads who are going through divorce. Dads who are going through divorce. And I was making some referrals to dads who would call me saying, I'm looking for some support. So I went to check out, it's like a drop-in. They have a meeting in Toronto every Thursday, and a meeting in Hamilton. And I went to the Toronto one just to sit in and see the vibe. And especially since I'm referring men, I want to see what's happening. And I was seeing men from across cultures and across religion and economic status. Thank you. And these guys had the similar stories that they were going in and not getting representation. The judge was not really engaged with them stories and so forth. I heard men, there's one guy who was a dread, who said his lawyer, who was a Jewish woman, said, you know what, you have to cut off your dreads, because if you go into the courts, the judge is not going to take you on, right? So there's all these little micro aggressions that's happening, and a lot of these men, a lot of these, like the men in that space were committed, right? But a lot of men give up. Because the one thing I didn't know, it's like for you to go to court for custody for a year, it costs us over $100,000 in legal fees, right? Wow. And I'm hearing men, if I saw on the street, I would think they're good. And a lot of these men in those rooms are bankrupt. You understand what I'm saying? Going through this process. And what you see was these men start to share their stories and start to support each other. And there was a good success rate of men getting more access to their kids, basically. But I think that's the big piece where you're seeing in the family court system, there's this big disparity in terms of men getting true equitable treatment, right? And I think we're sending the story that your role as a father is not important. We see it in the agency, we see it in the court system, we even see it in the schools, right? So and when I say in the schools, this is where, the administration will more so contact moms than they would contact dads. It's like, there's not even an attempt sometimes to even get dad's information, right? So I think these are some things we have to look at.
So there's obviously there's a perception that the mom's going to be more involved,
right,
than the father is
right.
going to be. One thing that you spoke on a little bit there that I just wanted us to explore a little bit, and that is, you said some of the men, they give up in the process. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit more, because I think there's there is a perception out there that a lot of times that the guys, they just don't care.
Yeah.
They just you know, they just don't want to be a father. They're not ready to be a father, and they just unplug. And then sometimes a woman will look at the situation for whatever reason, and she'll say, you know what, that's fine. I'll do it on my own. And then she's trying to raise it, you know, try to be mom and dad, which is impossible.
Right.
No matter how great of a mom you are, you
Right.
can never be a dad, or no matter how great of a dad you are, you can never,
Right.
you know, provide what a mom can provide.
Yeah.
You know, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the reasons as to why it is that, you know, why a guy would kind of look at his kid and say, you know what, I can't do this.
So I think, you know, I think that's an interesting question because, and I thought about this piece in a sense where, and this is just my humble opinion, right? I feel like with moms, there and maybe it's tradition or whatever it may be, but I think, you know, when I talk to dads, the dads who are present, there is a decision, there is a choice that each of these dads said, you know what, I'm going to stick around. Where I feel like with the moms that like most moms I speak, there's not really this choice. There is this automatic vibe that, you know, moms, you're taking on that role. You know what I'm saying? And that's I think that those are individual, but I think that's also a social piece, right? But that's one thing. The other piece I feel there is a young father. So I've worked with fathers from as young as 14 all the way up, you know, older men, you know what I'm saying, grandfathers, right? And for a young father who's 14, who's dropped out of high school, who was in high school, and then he became a dad, there is this moment of, and at 21, I was going through the same thing, right? Where I had, you know, I was going to school for music, Patrick, right? Just got the scholarship, and then my partner, who's not my wife, said, I'm pregnant. And school, like that, music stopped because I felt like music, I couldn't, most of my brethren who are doing music weren't able to provide for themselves, nevertheless a kid, right?
Yeah.
So there was this piece now that I felt like I had to stop what I want to do and play this role as a co-parent, co-partner, whatever, you know? But I think there's this piece where, again, fathers are, you know, and the same good thing goes for the moms as well. It's like you're making this hard change. There's all this change is happening all at once, basically. And it's like you're trying to figure out, again, if I'm a young dad and I'm trying to get my high school piece, then there's this issue then becomes, well, how can I provide if I can't get a job? Right? And I think there's this piece just talking to, you know, the dads that I talk to, like, these are the challenges that we're talking about. Like, so we have this idea of what fatherhood is, right? And that's being a provider. But then a lot of, for men, like black men, are not in positions to attain this stereotypical definition of fatherhood or masculinity, right? So this idea that you're supposed to be a provider, where these men are still struggling to get their high school diploma, and then even get post-secondary. And even if you get all through all of that, it's still finding a job that is, you know, that you're going to be paid. So you have a situation where dudes is like, okay, now I'm going to move to Alberta now. You know what I'm saying? Because I may get, you know, the payout is maybe better or whatever. So it's difficult to say, you know, I'm going to be like this nuclear idea or nuclear family is gonna, you know, is gonna do the vibe. So I think there's this big push. What we're trying to say with BDC, it's more around community. Yeah, if you understand what I'm saying.
So, for the women the mothers that are listening, you know, they might be saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying, Brandon, but you know what? If you know, I'm pregnant, I'm carrying the kid, I have the same struggles.
Yeah.
You know, I got to finish school too.
Right.
You know, and I now have to provide for this child. Why is it different for him? You know, why can't this guy do the same thing that I'm doing? You know, with some of the conversations that you've had with these men, how have they felt about that?
I think one of the big issues is this around support, right? It's the lack of support that is available to these men to succeed, right? And not just support, but it's like, look at some of the extenuating like some of the barriers, right? So again, it's like if I'm being surveilled because I live in a certain community, and I have that stress, I have a record, or may not have a record, but I'm still being surveilled. And if I get carded enough times, then I have there's a higher chance of me going in prison or getting a criminal record. And then that makes it even harder for me to be a provider. So I think there's this piece around, it's not making excuses, but I think we also have to recognize the realities of it. And I don't think we're even there as yet, right? I think, I was talking with a group of men yesterday in Scarborough, and one guy we're talking about this idea of stress, in the black community, how we're dealing with it. And I think someone said, this guy was like, yo, we're not dealing with the stress, we're escaping the stress, right? We're finding and so I think that's where I think we're at. We have this intersection of like hell and comfort, right? So I think we have to start and not look at the politicians or the new chief or for solution. I think there's this importance of, again, coming together and start to and talking about some of these issues, but we can't just stop at talking at it. I think we have to start looking at solutions that make sense to us, and then we have to start partnering. Then we go and start partnering with whomever that makes sense for the solution to take place, right?
Okay. We're gonna take another quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the support groups, because I know for women there are a plethora of support groups for single moms. Whether or not women choose to take advantage of those, but there's a lot that is out there, and that is fully funded across the city, across this country. But for men, aside from Black Daddies Club, maybe you can shed a little bit of light on what some of those support groups are for men. So if there is a guy who's listening out there who's thinking, I'm struggling with some of these things. I'm trying to find my balance with a father and trying to, make money, or with all the pressures that are happening. What are some of those support groups that I can I can reach out to? Okay. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about that.
The internet's number one on the World Wide Web. iLive Radio. You're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio. iLive Radio.
Welcome back, and I'm joined once again with Brandon Hay, and we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the support groups that exist out there for men, for fathers who want to stay connected with their children, and like you said earlier, sometimes it is a bit of a challenge. The court systems, is a bit of a challenge. I've heard a lot in and around that. I have a friend of mine. She works in the courts, and we used to talk about it all the time. And she said that she used to see these guys come in, and they have great intentions to be involved, to pay their fair share, and be a part of their children's life. But then, as they go through the court system, they become disconnected, and a lot of them just kind of give up. And so, for people who are kind of in that situation, for men who are in that situation, what can they do to be able to not reach that point where they just look at their child and say, I can't do this. This is just too much. This is too overwhelming.
I think so. That's what I think. Groups like, as I said, Father's Resources pays importance, right? Because then it's very difficult to do this isolated on an island, basically. And I think what what those spaces provide is that you see other men that you can reason with. You hear other stories. You start getting other tools, and so forth. You also have Young Potential Fathers, which is an organization or a Jima House that's based out on the Western Road in Lawrence, and they provide some programs. They have a training program for dads right now. And also have a program with Toronto Children Aid Society, basically. So recently there was this article saying that black youth or racialized kids are basically that increasing in numbers within that's in care basically, right? So we're seeing again the issue with CAS that going into black families or just racialized families basically and taking away kids where in other communities it's not as quick, right? So I think there's there's that there's YPF. Then you also have More Than a Haircut, which does work along the Eglinton West, Little Jamaica area by Eglinton West Station. On Thursdays, I work with
Sorry, you said More Than a Haircut?
More Than a Haircut, which is through Macaulay Child Development Center. And then I work on Thursdays with supporting young families, and there's a dad's group there, and that's through Yorktown Family Services. And yeah, so I mean, and if folks are interested, they could reach out to myself on the Black Daddies Club or find me on Facebook, and then I can share resources that way as well. But yeah.
Now, with a lot of what you're talking about, the support that you were saying that you needed, and the ability to be able to tell your story, share your story,
Right.
and be in a place where there are other people who are sharing their stories as well.
Yeah.
That means that you got to talk. You got to tell your story. And there's a huge perception out there that men don't like to talk.
Right. Right.
And that we don't like to share our feelings.
Yeah.
We don't like to talk about those things.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
So I think that's and I think for me that's the importance of creating spaces, right? Authentic spaces. And with Black Daddies Club, our model is going wherever the men are at. So it's not having a physical space that we're saying, dads come to where we're at, because we knew if I was running a mom's group, I could do that. Right? Mom is willing to travel and so forth. Where with dads, to get those authentic conversations, you got to go to where those spaces that they're at and that they're talking. So when we started, we're going into the barbershops, right? And in the barbershops, that's where black men, are speaking their truth, right? Languages and accents are flowing, right? And there's no really any holds bar, basically. For the summer, basically, some of our programs that we're doing is we do this weekly family hike out in Pickering. Well, not Pickering, Port Union area. We started last year, but it's every Sunday mornings, and it's for black dads and their family. And it's also for, women come out or wherever, but it's really about building communities, right? So you'll see dads and their kids talking, dads and other dads talking, and I think for me that's a dope piece, right? So it's why is that dope? Like in a barbershop, if I take my sons to get their haircut at my boy's house, who's a barber, they're hearing me talk about stuff that on a regular I'm not really, they're seeing the two sides of the dads, right? So I think it's also they're also getting abreast and getting to know me even better. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's important. That's something I didn't have growing up, right? And I think that there is this importance of stories to our children, right? That we don't really we don't value.
Maybe we talk about that for a little bit. And that is, the importance of being able to share your story, your experience, all that to the next generation. So you were in a situation where you didn't get that from your dad. And so now you have children.
Right.
So how do you bridge that gap? How do you then kind of look at it and say, okay, I got to tell my story. What should I be telling? How much do I tell?
Yeah.
Do I tell everything or hold back some?
Yeah.
Should I even say anything?
Yeah. I think, this is something I constantly struggle with, right? And the first time I recognized that my stories were of value to my kids basically was it was one day, it was pouring. It was a sad day, and it was pouring all day, and it was a break. And these guys are home, playing video games, and I was like, I want to get these guys out, right? And I took them outside, and there's like the stream along the sidewalk, essentially. And when I was a kid growing up in Jamaica, we used to like race bottle caps. You know what I'm saying? And I was like, yo, so I broke these different tree branches or whatever, and me and my kids start racing these things, right?
Yeah.
And these guys were super engaged, right? To the point that whenever it rains, these guys are like, yo, pops, let's go outside and you know what I'm saying, and race it. And for me, that was like, that was an epiphany because I was like, yo, even though these guys have whatever console or computer or Minecraft or whatever, these guys are still engaged. You know, my stories have that value basically. But I think in terms of, you know, stuff around, so for example, the issue of when my youngest son was maybe around, well, my middle son, he was around maybe 7. He was like, you know, pops, I was watching a show and I saw 2 guys kissing. What's up with that? You know? And for me, it was like, head was spinning. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, this was like all the training that, you know, this was the moment. This is like a do or die moment, whatever. And for me, there was this balance of what culture taught me, and then there was critical thinking, right? And I remember having that conversation with him, and and I keep on thinking that, again, that was for me, that was a proud moment, right? Because, and the reason that was important is because, again, I didn't have those moments, right, with my own pops, to where I had to these questions I was taking to my friends, and they're telling me a whole bag of nonsense, and or I go a guy who was an elder, but he was like not really an elder, you know what I'm saying? So I think there was this piece of like being that ability to like, yo, pass on your stories and your knowledge to your youths, and I think that there's just a gem in that.
How did you know you needed that though?
In terms of,
Like that support that you needed, or to be able to recognize that, you know, my experience is not enough for what I need to provide to my child. You know, you're all of a sudden you're thrust into fatherhood, and you're looking, oh my God, I'm responsible for this life. You know, not a lot of people have the ability to stop and think and say, wait a second, I need help. Like, how did you recognize that I need help here?
well, I think for you know, for myself, you know, my own pops was in Jamaica, and you know, we didn't necessarily have that tight relationship, and not until we got old, not until I got older, and then in 2005 he got murdered basically, right? And he was murdered by an 11-year-old kid who himself was fatherless, and
Wow.
then 2 weeks later that same 11-year-old kid was murdered by the same people who hired him.
Wow.
Right, and this was the equivalent of 200 Canadian for the amount of $200 Canadian, right?
Wow.
But for me, that wasn't necessarily the big piece. The big moment was talking to the police or the detective that was dealing with the case, and he was like talking about with this normalcy, right? And then he was like, "Yo, these kind of things happens all the time." And for me, I remember that I was thinking like, "Yo, you know, what you just told me happens all the time," and I kind of started thinking about this normalcy of crisis that's in our community, right? So whether it's in Spanish Town in Jamaica, or it's in Scarborough in Toronto, or in Brixton in London, or wherever in black communities, there is this idea that it's okay for our black children to grow up without their fathers, right? And for my kids, I didn't want that. Right, I didn't want that. I wanted to break that cycle. I think there's that one piece, but I think there's a frustration that was coming now when I was like, when I went on to Google and I type in black fathers, I'm seeing stuff around pimps or deadbeats. There's nothing around supports. There was just all the same stories, you know. I mean, the dopest dad I grew up seeing was Furious on Boys in the Hood, right? And I was like, because he was just real, you know, and he was like, you know, and I mean, I wanted to find, I wanted the Furious, you know, but I remember being inspired by that piece and wanting to be able to pass on that to my youths in the sense of just like having that real conversation with my kids, basically. But I didn't know how to do that. I didn't see that around. So I feel like it was, again, and it's not just myself. It's been, you know, working with other people, creating these spaces, and it's been growing from that space, right? So like when we started it, we had no clue that we'd be doing research or anything like that. It was just, yo, let's just find a regular space that we can catch up, maybe play some dominoes or just whatever. You know what I'm saying? But it's, again, it's just it's really trying to grow from the ground up, right?
We're going to take another quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the creation of that space, to be able to share your stories. And, you know, there are so many challenges that people of color we face, so many challenges fathers face, mothers face, and our ability to be able to connect with one another. And at times, you know, that child standing between the mom and the dad, and if they're not together anymore, it seems like such a huge divide that we can never really cross. So I want to talk about some of the things that, based on your experience with all these men that you've talked about, you know, as to how do they bridge those gaps when they're they're not with the partner anymore, but they still have this responsibility of this child. How do they make that work? Because that's a bit of a challenge. So I'm going to take another quick break and come back with Brendan Hay.
Okay.
The internet's number one on the World Wide Web. iLive Radio. You're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio. iLive Radio.
And we're back with Brendan Hay, my guest from Black Daddies Club. So yeah, we want to talk a little bit about, you know, what are some of the ways in which you found that these men within your discussions have been able to make it work? Because there's you know, the court system, we all know, is kind of heavier on one side than the other. There's a challenge there, you know, the cost that having to go through courts to be able to fight to see your children. There's so much negativity in the media about fathers not being involved, about, you know, deadbeat dads, all this sort of stuff. But if you're a father and you're genuinely trying to stay connected with your child, you know, what are some of the things that these men have been able to do to make it work?
Well, I think one of the big things that I found, some of the guys that I spoke to anyways, depending on the situation with mom, is if you know, is I'm going through the court system, going through mediation, right? And I felt like with going through mediation, there was more of a I think both parties were closer to an agreement, basically, right? And I think okay with the response. So I think there was more tools to let's work things together, basically.
For those who may not know, what exactly is the mediation process?
So mediation process is when you have a mediator that is working in between, and this is normally a lawyer that is working with both the mom and dad, and basically trying to put forth on taking all the things that mom wants to get done and all the things that dad wants to get done, and trying to meet somewhere in the middle. Where if you go to a custody in the court system, it's essentially you're leaving up to the judge to make a choice in terms of who is going to get custody, basically. So there's a bunch of different things that can affect that, whether it's, you know, how good your lawyer is and et cetera. So that's one piece. I think the other piece is for dads to get educated, right? If you're going through that process, there's an importance of, again, going and connecting with, and proactively, right? Going out and connecting with groups like Fathers Resources and you know, and looking out and seeing, like, trying to learn as much as you can on the process, right? Yeah.
So a lot of it, what you're talking about, again, it goes back to finding support groups.
Right.
And a lot of people say, as black men, we don't like to ask for help. And if we're asking for help, there's a perception that we might be weak. How do you when you do end up talking to these guys, how do you reach them to be able to get them to understand that they can't do this alone?
Right. So I think that's the piece, man. I think the one thing I've learned is, and you kind of touched on it, is that if I'm a father and I don't feel that I need the support, I'm not going to engage in the group, right? Especially if I think it's just a support group. So that's why we change it up, right? So it's like we have like discussions and support groups and sessions and so forth. But then we also have like flag football, like kids that, dads and kids flag football pieces, or the hiking pieces, or the barbecue pieces, or the barbershops. And it's to really go to like do these different pieces where then once the men them come into the space and hear the dialogue, it's that they're gonna, not even just, we don't just to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes if we rather you hear it than not hear it, but we wanted to engage in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole piece is for folks to take it out, take it back to whatever you learn and bring it back to your circle and bring it around your kitchen table, right? So I think that's the piece where it's and I think the reality as well, it's like, some of the dads are super busy. Same as the moms, like we're working, like doing multiple jobs or whatever it may be. So I think in terms of saying, like in terms of this engaging, that's why we don't necessarily do regular programming per se, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really doing like certain set events. Right. And to be totally honest with you, Patrick, like in terms of with BDC, like in the last 2 years, we've been going through this restructuring process. One is I went back to school to deepen the work. And B was not really, the one thing I recognize in the last 7 years or now 8 years is that to do the work that we want to do, it's difficult to do that in this traditional nonprofit sector, which is applying for grants to get funding, basically to do the work. Because what we're finding is that you're focusing way too much time on writing these grants to actually do the work, right? So I think for us, it's really that's been the opportunity of doing this work how we've been doing, which is really grassroots, is to take those learnings and being nimble enough to change. Right, to what the need is.
Okay, so how do people reach you? How do people?
Right. So you can go onto the website, which is theblackdaddiesclub.com, and that's BlackDaddiesClub.com, or on Facebook, as well as Twitter. Email is at info@blackdaddiesclub.com, and that's BlackDaddiesClub.com.
How long? You said 2007.
2007, yeah.
And this really all came out of a need that you felt that you had.
Right.
What happens if, for some of the guys who come to the group, do they even realize that they have a need?
I think the one thing I've seen from the guys who comes to the group is, especially the guys who come back, is that they there's a need that guys are looking for spaces. Let's put it that way, right? Like, so even though there's a perception that men don't need help, men are looking for space that are authentic to them, basically, right? And the guys who come is like, they're like, yeah, like this space is needed. I come to this space because there's nothing else that's speaking to me directly as a black man as well as a father, right? So I think that is important. So to your question early on, like, well, why not call it the Daddies Club? Because again, it's like, then I couldn't speak from a place that is of experience, right? And then these other men would not be able to speak from that same place, which is super important, right? So again, it's really building out a storytelling at the end of the day.
And we get a lot of media from out of the U.S. And our culture here in Canada is a little different than what goes on
Right.
in the U.S.
Right.
Our background's very different.
Yeah.
Our experience, our stories are very different than what happens in the U.S. But we get bombarded so much with the American perspective on things.
Yeah.
How do you balance that when you're having these conversations with the men? Like you mentioned, Boys in the Hood earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so many of our young men today are looking to the U.S. Interpretation of what a black man is,
Yeah.
and trying to sort of live up to that, but we don't exactly fit that based on our history. How do you sort of walk through that balance with those guys?
Well, I think that's the key thing is really to center the conversation around the people in the room, right? So even though, and we we draw on some of those similarities. So it's not similarities. So it's not like say we're gonna shun and not from we can still draw on Jermaine Carby as well as we can draw on Trayvon Martin, right? So I think we can look at certain similarities in terms of prison industry or just police brutality or whatever it may be, right? But I think it's to look at the synergies, but I think it's also important for us to focus and look at our own stories within those rooms. And I think from there it's then to look at how we connected by those stories in those rooms. And I think once folks in a room start seeing how their stories are connected. So let me give you an example. I remember we were doing a session on Jenna Finch one time, and before the discussion, one dad came up to me and was like, "Listen, I'm going through some issues around custody and housing. Can we talk about this after? Cool." And I said, "Okay, cool." And he's like, "Please don't bring it up." I was like, "Cool." And then another dad came to me maybe 15 minutes later and saying, "Listen, I'm going through some issue around custody and housing." So during the conversation, I brought up custody and housing basically, and I started talking about it. And one guy started to talk about his story, right? And then this other guy started to talk about his story. And then this other guy was like, "You know what? One of my boys is going through something similar." So at that point, something became these individuals became from who were isolated basically started to like find a connection, right? And then what was happening then is like we started seeing one guy was like, this is what he's doing or whatever, and then the other guys were like, "Yo, okay, cool. Like I didn't know you can do that." So there's this teaching that's happening amongst each other, right? And I think that's the key approach, right? I think it's super important that we're creating these spaces that we center it around our own stories basically, and really promote that, right?
I definitely want to thank you for spending the time with us today
thanks
and
for having
talking
me,
about
man.
your organization,
For sure.
and shedding some light on some of the struggles that exist out there with what fathers are going through at all ages, really.
Right.
Some of the key things, I would say for those who are out there is definitely find your space. Find your place that you can go and you can share your stories. Definitely share your stories with the next generation that's coming up. Being able to spend that time. There are a lot of challenges out there that we do face from a court's perspective. In my own experience going through the courts, it was it was a ridiculous situation. But for me, I grew up not knowing who my father was. And for me, it was paramount for me that my kids were never going to have that experience. Right. It was a decision I made that the cycle was going to stop here.
Right.
That I was going to be the last person in my family, that this cycle was going to continue with. And I think for the men who are listening out there, no matter how difficult the struggle is, find your support. And your support may not necessarily be the people who are standing right beside you, because their experience in life is probably about the same that you've had. But looking for some elders, looking for somebody who's gone through it before, looking for an organization such as yours, the Black Daddies Club, that you can get together with other individuals and share your story and be able to draw some strength from, and then being able to have those conversations with the next generation to make sure that they understand that they can do better, and that they learn from our experiences, because if they don't learn from my choice or your choice, where are they going to learn it from? You know, they're going to look to their friends, they're going to look to the media. And you know, when you look at media, pretty much you look at every TV show out there, the dads are an idiot. You know, whether it's Family Guys or The Simpsons or, you know, How I Met Your Mother, every one of any show that's out there today, you know, the dad's an idiot and the mom looks after everything. And so that plays deeply in the psyche of so many different men. And I'm very happy that you've taken the time to create an organization like this that met your need and is also meeting others within the community. So definitely keep up the good work, and I hope that people will continue to reach out to you and you continue to do that good work. Definitely want to thank everybody today for joining us, for spending your time with Mars Venus. And yeah,
I just want to make a mention. So we're starting the family hike at Trail Ridge Park on June 6th, Sunday, June 6th. And it's every Sunday for the summer, starting at 10:30. But for more information, just go on to the Black Daddies Club or on Facebook. Just type it in and let's go from there. But yeah, thank you.
great. Thanks everyone for your time, and I will talk to you next week. Take care.